I had been the Moscow bureau chief for the Post by the time I started that book. And also, the Post had prepared me for that by giving me a year sabbatical, which I spent at Oxford at St. Anthony's College studying language and preparing for it. And one of the things that was evident to me, and also in some ways I prepared as in the 80s, right? Because as I said, the Cold War was a big deal all the way through the 80s and part of the very first years of the 90s. And one of the things that I recognized when I was at Oxford is that all of the story of what had actually happened in the Cold War was sort of lopsided. The American side was gradually being declassified, people writing memoirs. You know, we had Strobe Talbot and Richard Pearl, and we had all these people's memoirs. And so there was at least a narrative on the American side, and the Soviet side was completely kind of closed. It was stale propaganda speeches published in Pravda that we didn't really know what happened on their side. And when Reagan made that speech about Star Wars, a big question was how did the Soviets react? We didn't really know. So I had this like nagging feeling of asymmetry in the narrative, a huge one, and wanting this kind of fix that. So my hope with the book when I started out was, could I write a book that would tell the story in stereo from both sides? And it was tough going for a couple of years. It was really tough going. I had, now been in Moscow 6 years. I had accumulated boxes and boxes of material. It was a period of openness. I was enjoying a period more open than any time during the Cold War. So I thought maybe I can get enough stuff to accomplish my goal, but I really was not getting enough stuff. And then a professor here in Maryland gave me a tip about some papers that had been deposited at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And being kind of ambitious and younger, I just got on a plane and went out there to look at them. And nobody had looked at these papers. They were still in boxes, kind of a mess. Nobody had sorted them. There was no finding aid. But I recognized immediately that these were the papers taken from basically the equivalent of the National Security Council of the Kremlin. It was called the Defense Council, but it is really their inner staff office of the Soviet leader during the late Cold War. And the person who took them was a man named Vitaly Leonidovich Katayev. And Vitaly Katayev was a staffer, like an NSC staffer in the Kremlin. And his specialty was long range missiles, both land based and later sea based. And over time, Katayev brought a lot of stuff home. He kept it in a closet at home. This is really important inside stuff, a monograph on how they reacted to the Star Wars, uh, all kinds of interesting papers about different kinds of weapons, mostly nuclear weapons. So I spent a fair amount of time, but at the bottom of the box, I found an inventory. And again, all of this is in Russian. So my years of study, I wasn't great at it, but I could at least tell what I was looking at. The inventory pointed out that this was half of the Katayev collection. The other half was still in Moscow. Well, I did some detective work. I had friends there, and I found the other half in Moscow with his granddaughter still in the closet. I went there because I had been there often, so it was not hard to go at that time. And when I went there, I found the whole second half of the archive, and the granddaughter helped me process it and copy it. It was a very complex archival kind of story, but look, here it was the other half of the story, the inside story of what the Soviet leaders were thinking and doing in the Cold War arms race. And most of this was about weapons, conventional weapons, delivery systems, and nuclear, a little bit about chemical. But 2 years after I found these papers, I heard and realized that there was one more box that the Hoover Institution had kept secret because Katayev, when he donated the papers, had insisted that this last box be kept secret for a number of years. And it opened up, I think, in 2006 or seven when I was working on this on New Year's Day, really. And I was the first person at the archive on the day after New Year's, and I opened the box, and the box was the secret papers about biological weapons and the illicit biological weapons program that the Soviet Union had maintained during the Cold War. So, long story short, I set out at the beginning to remedy this asymmetry. It was hard work and I didn't get there. And then finally, I fell through a trap door. And this was thousands of pages of documents, all in Russian, showing me what the Soviet leaders were thinking. And then matching that up again with my reporting on the US side, I was able to, I think, finally create this stereo picture of what happened. And the book was published in 2009. It was a long, long, difficult process. One of the things that happened right after the Soviet Union collapsed is the Americans were very worried about what kind of loose nukes there might be, and teams were sent over there with this permission of the new Russia under Yeltsin to try and examine this. And it went on for a number of years. And I tell the story in the book. But one of these teams, led by a General Burns, was sent to a part of Russia where they were transporting their nuclear weapons, mostly warheads. And the Soviets were discovered to be to be trans to be transporting these nuclear weapons on cattle cars made with like sides made out of wood with the things kind of just jammed in. I mean, completely insecure rail cars that any terrorist could have just busted down with an axe and taken one. And because, in the Soviet system, they didn't worry too much about insiders, and it was a police state and people were in fear. So I guess they felt it was secure. We did not. The United States, with great foresight and secrecy, airlifted and by sea lifted one of those train cars all the way to Sandia National Laboratories in the United States. We built secure cars to match the gauge of their rails and ship them back so that they would have secure cars in which to take the nuclear warheads. So that was the kind of ambition that existed in the period right after the collapse. It was also part of my story, and General Burns is the father of Bill Burns, who was later Deputy Secretary of State and CIA Director for the United States. So also, I wanted to tell people the Dead Hand was a system built before Gorbachev in the Brezhnev times. The Soviets were very, very afraid of a U.S. first strike, a first nuclear strike. And this was a system that would automate or maybe semi-automate the response by creating a deep underground bunker and putting 3 duty officers in that bunker and giving them sensor information about what was happening in the atmosphere, on the ground, and in the Kremlin. And if all the sensors lined up, these 3 officers had procedure to launch all the Soviet nuclear weapons back at the United States. It was a retaliatory system, and it existed then. It still exists today. And this is not a big part of the book, but it lent it the title.